Hi everyone, it's James here from Junior Developer Central, and this tutorial is a follow-up to our previous tutorial where we created a JavaScript custom audio player with playlist and visualization, and we're going to be adding a few extra features. And this actually comes from one of our community members, Pandona Music, who actually asked to put in these features into the audio player. So I thought I'd create this follow-up video where we can go through some of those additional features. So super quickly, I'm just going to demonstrate those features and then we'll jump into the code. So basically we've got this playlist of audio files and we can play those from here like this. We've now got a custom progress bar at the bottom here, where you can see we've got the timer counting up to the duration of the song, and we've got the progress bar which is advancing as the song continues, but we can actually use that to seek to different parts of the song, so we can go forwards and backwards through that. And if we actually go to the end of the song here and let it just finish the audio file off, it'll actually go on to the next item in the audio playlist that we've got there. And we've got forward and back buttons as well, so we can go back to the previous song, we'll go forwards to the next one, and we can cycle through that until we get to the last song, which will then take us back to the first song in our playlist. So that's pretty much all of the new features. It's basically this component at the bottom here. So we're going to be adding this to our existing JavaScript audio player, and it's all done with vanilla JavaScript. So let's jump into the project and start coding up this progress bar. So the code is in GitHub and you can clone it from a link in the description below this video, and I've actually created this on a separate branch called progress bar, so if you want to check out the end result, just go to that branch. But I'm just going to go back to the master branch, which essentially is where we left off the previous video, and if we go back to the audio player in the browser, once it's reloaded, this is what we had at the end of the last video. So we're going to be adding this custom progress bar component at the bottom here. So because the custom progress bar wasn't part of the plan for the original audio player when I created it, we need to first do a little bit of refactoring to our existing code to accommodate it. And then we're going to be creating the progress bar elements all through JavaScript, so we don't need to create any markup in our HTML. And there are several methods that we need to implement which will handle the next buttons and the previous buttons. And then we're going to create a function that handles the updating of the time and the progress bar, which will allow us to navigate through each of those audio files. So the first thing we're going to do in our audioplayer.js file that we've got in our repository, let's actually go down to the section where we've got the create playlist elements. So if you remember from the previous tutorial, this was just a list of anchor tags that when you click them, it actually plays the audio item. And you can see all this method is doing really is looping through all of our audio files and then creating those anchor tags and setting an icon and also setting up an event listener. But what I'm going to do with this, instead of actually just looping through them, I'm actually going to map this into a new property on our audio player class. So we'll say this.audio elements is going to be equal to this.audio, and we kind of want the same thing here, so we're just going to map them and keep the rest of the code as it is and just return the audio item for each of the audio files. So this time, as well as creating the anchor tags, what we're actually going to be doing is returning the created audio item and saving it into a property called this.audio elements, which will make it easier for us to navigate through each of those with the previous and next buttons. And one thing we'll do to initialize the audio player itself is we had a property on the class called this.currentAudio, which represents the current audio file that's playing. And we're just going to set that to the first audio item in the audio elements array that we've just created. So that's pretty much all we need to do for our refactoring. We can now go on to actually create our progress bar elements. And we had a method in the original class called createPlayerElements, and we're going to create a few new elements in there to hold our progress bar. But we have a bit of a problem because the actual code that we've got here, this whole container element for the audio player was a flexbox, and obviously it's going left to right. And if we want to put something below it, we'll need an overall containing element so we can put an element underneath it. So we'll go actually and create that containing element within our createPlayers method now. And let's just do it at the top here. So we'll say create a new variable container element, and we'll say document.createElement, and it can just be a div. It can be any other element that you like. We'll use our CSS to style it in a second. And let's just give that a class. So we'll say it's class list, and we'll call it container. And again, we'll set that up in just a second. And so what we're going to do down here, instead of appending all of these items directly to the player element, which was the overall container that we had in the previous tutorial, we'll change that. Actually, let's just grab all those and change it to the container element. So they're now inside that new div that we've just created. And then what we'll do is for the actual player element, we'll append that child, the container element, which will just put all of our items inside of that newly created container. So the other thing we're going to want to do is create the progress bar element as well. So that again can just be a div, progress bar element, and we'll just say document.createElement and a div. And what we'll do, we'll actually put that after the container that holds the rest of the audio player. We'll just put that at the bottom there. Progress bar element, and we'll probably want to also put a class on that so we can style it. So the progress bar lm class list .add, and we'll just give it a class of progress bar. Okay, so now we've got our progress bar created. If we look at that in the actual app, you'll see this is the new progress bar element. We'll fix the styling in a moment in our Sass file, but before we do that, let's actually just create the progress bar elements, and I'm going to create a new function called create progress bar elements, and I'm going to pass that in the progress bar element as well, so we can actually use that inside that method. And for the moment, I'm just going to stub this out, and we'll fill in the details in just a moment. So first of all, I'm going to create another container element, and because we're going to be putting quite a few bits and pieces inside here, and I'll give that a class list here as well. There we go. And one thing we're going to want is a couple of buttons to go forwards and backwards through our playlist. So let's create another element, and I'm going to use buttons for this. In reality, it doesn't matter if you want to use something else and style it differently, because we'll just be setting up an event listener on these, but buttons makes a reasonable choice for these elements at the moment. So I'm actually going to add a bit of HTML into these now. It's some content inside of the buttons. We could just say forwards and backwards, use text, but we had Font Awesome loaded in the previous video, so we can use those icons. And there's one for the next button, there's one called FA forward, and just close that I tag. And we'll have a similar one for the previous button, but this time we'll go backward. So we're going to set up some event listeners to handle the forward and backward actions in a second. But before we do that, let's finish off creating the elements here. So I'm going to create a new element, and I'm going to save this onto a member of the class called progress bar. And this is actually going to be a canvas element. Oops, if I can spell canvas. And this will also have an event listener that we'll configure in a little bit as well. And we're also going to have this timer element is just going to be holding the duration and the elapsed time of each audio file. And we'll just put some text inside there. Again, I'm going to use a div. It doesn't really matter too much in this instance, but we will just give it a class so that we can style it. And it's timer. And then the overall container element that we created, I'm going to append the child for the previous button, and we also want to do that for the next button as well. And because the order that we add these elements actually matters, it's how they appear in the actual document itself. In between those, I'm actually going to put in the timer element. If you want to have the buttons appearing differently, then you can obviously mix this up and play with where they appear in the actual progress bar component. And that container element now holds the previous button, the next button, and also the time information. So for our progress bar element that's been passed into this function, I'm going to append the container, which will show that. And we'll also, we created the actual progress bar itself, which is the canvas. And I'm just going to append the this.progress bar onto that element that's containing all of this new code. So if we save that and take a look at it in the browser, so here you can see those new buttons appearing, and this canvas element will actually be the progress bar. So it's not appearing just as we like it at the moment. So let's go and fix that in our styling. So the first thing we're going to do inside of our audio player is to configure that container class, which we've used in a couple of places. And I'm just going to say display as flex. And that will make everything appear side by side, which is what we're after for the containers. And then we created a class, or we added a class called progress bar. So let's give that some styling now. I'm just going to set the background color to white and make sure the width is 100%. Again, this is all stuff that you can kind of customize yourself, depending on how you want the progress bar component to actually appear. But I'm going to put in a minimum height and some padding, and then we'll target the canvas that's inside of the progress bar because we want that to appear slightly differently to the visualization canvas. Make sure that's 100%, and I'm going to give that a height of 8 pixels so we can get a nice narrow bar across the bottom. Again, something else that you can play with if you like. And we'll just set the background color to black. And we also want to customize the container element inside of the progress bar. So we know it's a flex element, but let's put the justification to space between and make sure the align items is center so they appear in the middle of the container. And the other thing we'll need to do is just give the timer class a color. And it should default to black anyway for the text, but just so it's in there so we can modify it if we need to. So if we save that and look at the project again, so we can see our canvas item there and we can see the button, but what we actually want to do is get this progress bar element to the bottom of here. So we can do something to fix that, and what we need to do is in our audio player, it's set as flex at the moment, but we're just going to set the flex direction to column. And this was why in the few steps ago when we refactored the audio player, we put another container here. In fact, if we have a look at that in the source. So we could then have some kind of containing element which will hold the previous project, and then the progress bar down here is kind of like an add-on. So you'll notice the progress bar is spilling out a little bit here, and that's simply because we've added some padding. And we can fix that in our code just by setting the box sizing of our elements. And if we set that to border box, it'll just respect that padding for us and it'll make sure everything lines up okay. So that's all we needed for our styling. What we'll do now is implement the forwards and backwards actions for those buttons, and we need to create some new methods for that. So let's go back into our JavaScript code. So I'm going to create a new method called update current audio, which will take one parameter, which is essentially one of those audio elements that we saved onto the class in the create playlist elements that you can see just down here. And the role of this method will be to basically say, here's a new audio element, let's set this one playing based on its href attribute, which will hold the URL of the audio to load. So a few things here first, and this was something from our previous tutorial. We can actually set the playing icon of the current audio item. So this will just update the audio item in our playlist section to show that it has a play icon so that the previous file that was playing can still be played. And then we'll actually update that current audio item to the next audio element that's been passed in. And then we can also then set the pause icon for that current element. So this will just make sure that all of our icons are kept up to date. But the real thing that we want to do is basically make sure that the audio element, so this is the HTML5 audio tag on the player, we want to make sure that that source has been updated. So from our current audio that's been selected by the user, let's get the attribute, or get its href attribute rather, and then we can just set it as playing. So one important thing in this method as well is just to check if the audio context has actually been created or not. So in the previous tutorial we had to add this safeguard in because we don't want to create the audio context until the user's actually clicked a button, because otherwise the browser will actually block it. But if the user has pressed something, as in this instance, we want to make sure that the visualizer is actually created. So this method will handle updating our current audio that's playing. We need to create the methods that will handle playing the next audio item and the previous audio item as per the buttons in the progress bar. So let's say play next, and we can say play previous. So one thing that's really important for these methods to know is what is the index of the currently playing item. So we'll do that by creating a new variable called index, And in our audio elements that we set up in the initial step, we're going to look inside there and find the element that matches a particular condition. So if we just say for each of those is an audio item, and we'll just, for that audio item, we'll get its href. And we'll just say, is that equal to the current audio item that's playing? Is it equal to that audio item's href as well? And if it is, we should actually get the index of the item that's currently playing. And with that information, in the next function, we can work out which is the next audio item. So if the index value is bigger than or equal to the audio element's length -1 because of our zero-based array, then we've reached the actual end of the playlist, so we actually need to get the first item in the array. So from those audio elements, just get the first one. But if not, in our audio elements array, we can get the item at the index +1, which will basically be the next item in our playlist. So once we've got the next audio item, we created that previous function of update current audio, and we just pass in the next audio item. And the play previous function is pretty much identical. We still need to find out the index again, but the actual condition that we need to check is slightly different. So if the index is less than or equal to 0, it should never really get below 0, but just as a safeguard. So if that's the case, what we need to do is actually get the last item in the array, because we've reached the start of the playlist. So we'll say this.audio elements, and the index we'll use in there is the length of the audio elements at -1. But if not, we're going to go to our audio elements array and just go back 1 in the array. So that's pretty much all we need for our functionality of going through the playlist with those two buttons, but we just need to wire them up to our buttons that we created up here. So for the next button, we're going to add an event listener, and it's for click, and we're going to pass in the play previous function, but we also need to bind this to it as well, just so it's got the context of the class that we're talking about. And previous button is pretty much the same. Add event listener, click, and this dot play previous. I've mixed that up there. This is this dot play next. There. If we can spell, there we go. This dot play next and this dot play previous. Bind it to this. So let's check that out in the browser and make sure that's working. So let's say we're playing this element here, and we want to go forward. Yeah, you see, so we move to the next track, and you can see the icons are updating here. So if you didn't understand why we were using those two functions there before, that's why. So next one, and this should take us back to the start. Yep, so that takes us to the next, well, the first item in the array, and we can hopefully go backwards as well. And yep, it goes to the end of the playlist as well. So that all seems to be working pretty well. Let's go and create the method that will update our timer in the middle of the page here. So I'm going to create a new function on our class, or a new method called update time. I'll create a new simple helper function inside here as well, which will actually take one variable called time. And what this is actually going to do is take in a time that's given to us in seconds and actually return it as a representation of minutes and seconds. So the audio element will actually let us know how long a song is, but it's in seconds, and it will let us know what point in the track we are actually at, but again it will be in seconds. So this function will be useful to display it in a more human-friendly manner. So let's create a variable in here called seconds, and I'm going to wrap this inside of string, but what we're actually going to do is we're going to say math.floor, and we'll use the modulus operator to say 60 seconds, and we'll pad that with zeros if we're in a single digit number. And the next thing we'll do is create the minutes. But this time we'll actually divide the time in seconds by 60, and the math.floor will ensure that we'll actually remove any decimal points from the minutes that come back. And then what we'll do here is just return a template literal with the minutes and the seconds. So one thing that could happen here is we could get a null or untruthy value that comes through in time. So this will actually fail. We'll get like not a number if we try and use the math.floor function here. So if that does fail, we can put a safeguard in there just by passing in or 0. And it might look a bit funny. We'll get 0 minutes and 0 seconds come back, but it's better than the actual app throwing an error. So that little helper function is really useful, but we need to work out the actual current time of the audio element that's playing and also the length of the audio track as well. So we can do that by getting two properties out of our audio element, and that is again our HTML5 audio element. And those two properties are current time and duration. So I can destructure them from this this dot audio element. And then once we've got the actual times themselves, in our timer div that we created, we can actually update its inner HTML and again set it as template literal, and we'll say parse time for the current time, and then we'll just use a / and then we'll say parse time and then pass in duration. So that function will handle the updating of the timer in the middle of the progress bar container, but we actually need to work out a way of calling this for every second that elapses while the audio is playing. But luckily this is dead easy. We just need to hook it into an event on this.audio elem. So where we create that up here in the player elements, we could put it anywhere, but it makes sense to put it next to where we create the element itself. So what we want to actually do is set up an event listener on the audio element, and let's say add event listener. And the event we're listening for is time update. So this is fired every time the time of the audio element is updated. And we just want to pass in the update time function, which again, we'll just bind this to make sure it's got the reference to the class. So if we save that and go back to our browser, let's try playing something. And now you can see that timer's there, and you can see it's updating. And when we pause the audio, you can see it stops as well. So that's got our time elements updating. Now let's actually work on the progress bar. So the first thing we're going to do is actually work on getting it to progress as the time updates. So let's go to where we created our other methods, and I'm going to create a new one here, just called update progress bar. And the first thing we need to do is find out how much of the audio has actually played so that we can actually draw that as progress. So I'm going to create a function here just to make things a little bit easier. And it's going to basically take 3 parameters: the current time that's being played, the overall duration, and also the width of the canvas element itself. And we're just going to use that to create a simple calculation. So we'll say the current time of the audio that's playing divided by the overall time, and this will be in seconds, so it'll be a reasonably easy calculation. And that will work out how much of the actual audio is played as a fraction, and then we just multiply that by the width of the canvas. And we can use that to draw the actual progress on the canvas element. But first of all, we're going to get the current time and the duration again from the audio elem. And then we need to get the context of the canvas itself. So we'll just call this progress context equal to this.progress bar.get context 2D. And the first thing we want to do is just reset it to a black bar. We can do this on each call to update progress bar. And we'll set the fill style equal to black, and then fill a rectangle with that. So we can just say from 0, 0 position, and we can go all the way along this progress bar dot width and this progress bar dot height. So that's just resetting the whole canvas element to black. But then once we've done that, on our context again, we set the fill style to something else. And you can choose any color really that you want here, but I'm going to use a slightly green color. And again, on the context, we just do a fill rectangle. And starting at 0, 0 again, we'll call our progress size function to work out how wide the bar should actually be. And that is to know the current time, the overall duration, and the progress bar dot width. And of course we want it to fill the whole height of the progress bar too, so we'll use this.progressbar.height. So we've already bound the update time function to the time update event that kind of comes out of the audio element, so we could just in here just say this update progress bar, and that will be called every time the time is updated as well. So let's check that out in the browser. And you can see that audio item is playing, the time is updating, and also our progress bar is advancing as the audio item plays through. So that wasn't too tricky. The other thing that we need to do as well is to do the navigation of the progress bar element as well, which is slightly more complicated, but in essence, to break it down, what we need to do is register a click event on the canvas and then work out where the user has actually clicked in terms of the progress bar. So are they clicking towards the end or towards the start? And then convert that into a time of how much of the audio has actually played at that point in the progress bar, and then just update the current time of the audio element with that value, which will reset the audio to a particular point. So there's quite a few things going on there, but we can simplify it a bit in our code. Let's actually go to where we created the audio elements for the progress bar, and in particular where we created the canvas. So the first thing we can do is say this.progress bar, add event listener, click. And this time, instead of binding to a method on the class, I'm just going to inline this function here, which will make our lives a little bit easier for this. And it's also good to show you different ways of how you can actually set up these event listeners when you're working with JavaScript classes. So when I was setting this up, one of the things I had problems with is working out the actual width of the canvas on the page, because I was getting some strange results when I was working with this.progressbar.width. So we can actually use a function on the window object called getComputedStyle, which will actually work out the width of the elements on the page. So let's create a new variable in here called progressBarWidth, and we'll parse int because it actually comes back as a string, and window.get computed style, and we basically pass in that the progress bar element, which is the canvas, and then from that we just access its width property. And this, in our progress bar width variable now, will have the exact width of the canvas item on the page. And that's quite important because we need to work out the amount that's completed. So we can do that by creating a new variable called amount complete, and in our event object we can access the client X position, which is essentially where the user has clicked on the screen, and from that we can then say get the progress bar element, and we can use a special function called get bounding client rectangle, which essentially returns an object with the dimensions of our progress bar, and then we can get its left property, which means no matter where the element is on the page, we can actually work out where on the actual progress bar the user has clicked. And all we need to do then is just divide that by the progress bar width. So this amount complete variable will now tell us a rough percentage of where the user has clicked on the actual canvas element. With that knowledge, what we can then do is if we access our audio element and its current time property, we can actually assign a value to that. And we'll basically say how long is the existing audio that's playing, or we might want to set it as 0 if the audio element hasn't got an item playing currently, and just multiply that by the amount that's complete. So for example, if our duration was 100 and we're multiplying it by an amount complete of 0.1, we would get 10 back, which would put 10 seconds back into the current time, thereby setting our audio element playing at 10 seconds. So let's save that and we'll go back to the browser and check that out. So let's start something playing. So you can see our progress bar is going ahead, and if we click somewhere along here, you can see it jumps to 45 seconds, and we can go backwards to 24 seconds and then go right to the end as well. And that seems to be working quite nicely. So the last thing to handle is when the audio item that's currently playing actually ends. So in this instance, the last item in the playlist here has finished playing, but it doesn't move on to the next item in the playlist, which would obviously be the first one in this example. So actually this is really easy to set up. If we just go back to our code one last time, and where we set up our audio element, and we've configured an event here for time update, we're going to do something similar here as well. We're going to set up another event which is fired by our audio element, and the event we'll listen to is ended. So when a song actually ends, when an audio file has finished playing, we can then just say play the next item, which, as we've set up our play next and play previous functions, we can just call that directly and the next item should start playing in our playlist. So let's save that and go back to the browser. Let's say if we were playing this one here, let's just check that the navigation still works for that as well. So if we get right to the end of the progress bar here and click there, there's a couple of seconds left of that and it should move on to the next one. And because we've got the icons being updated in the play next and play previous methods, you can see that it handles all of our icon updating as well. Let's just try that one last time here so we can skip through the actual track. And yeah, it moves on to that last one. Let's just see if it moves on to the first item in the playlist as well. So a couple of seconds left. Yeah, and it takes us to the first item in the playlist. So there you go, that's our updated JavaScript audio player, complete with customizable progress bar. And we've got the previous next buttons and also the duration that a track has been playing. And we've got that full implementation of the playlist so that you can actually play an audio file, and then when that audio file is finished, it will move on to the next one. So we didn't do too much customization in terms of styling, so the buttons could obviously be updated, and you could do something a bit more interesting with this text here for the time. And possibly as well with the progress bar as well, you could do something a bit more interesting with that, but just to show you how it works, and show you how the events are set up in terms of navigating to parts of the audio file. I'll leave it up to you to put your own customizations in for the styling of the progress bar. So that's it for this tutorial. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you found this useful. And the code again is in GitHub, so you can look at the final project and get the starter files if you need to, if you want to have a go at implementing this yourself. So see you in the next tutorial.